Hello and welcome to this week's Liverpool.com podcast, where Liverpool are remaining in their summer holidays, but there's plenty going on to discuss. The ongoings of the summer and everything that comes from that. It's James Martin and Matt Addison with myself, Dan Morgan. The Euros are on. We're all getting stuck into those. They're good. They're providing some good games, as we know. There's a little bit of Liverpool chat around that. And then there's other things. Obviously, the fixtures were released this morning when we're recording this. Liverpool will open the season to Norwich away. They have a tough fixture list around Christmas, which we wrote a piece on Liverpool.com that you can check out. And in general, James, it just seems that it's a very manageable and decent fixture list for Jurgen Klopp, apart from that run of tough fixtures around the Christmas period.
Yeah, it's not panned out badly at all. I mean, Norwich is the first game, doesn't leave us too long to get a Suarez return deal over the line. But other than that, yeah, no, don't mind the look of it at all.
Oh, it feels like content, that. Let's discuss that after the pod. The ones that stick out, Matt, are the Man City and Chelsea fixture and Manchester United fixtures, and then the derby, obviously. So, when you look at it, I'll just get them up now for when they are. City at home 2nd of October, away 29th of April. That away game could be interesting. United 23rd of April, 23rd of October away, 19th of March at home. So bit of disparity between them in terms of being opposite ends of the fixture list. First derby, which looks like a Monday night, or definitely a midweek, which will be interesting. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the go-to fixtures, what do you make of where they are, where they're scattered around?
Yeah, it's quite spread out, isn't it? Which I quite like. I think the Manchester City ones are the ones that I've got my eye on. I expect Liverpool to be right up there and challenging, and I think they'll be the ones to challenge if Liverpool are going to win the Premier League. And I think it's interesting where they've fallen in terms of, I think it's the 7th game in that Liverpool play Man City at Anfield. So you look at the first 6 fixtures for Liverpool and for City. Liverpool's slightly easier, I think, on paper, it's fair to say. So fingers crossed Liverpool can sort of get themselves into a position similar to what they did a couple of years ago, where they went into that game, I think, slightly in front, beat them and made that gap a little bit larger. And that sort of set Liverpool up, I think, for the rest of that season. So I think that'll be important. And I think, the reverse fixture, I think, is the 7th to last game. Again, obviously different fixtures to come after that, but I think those are the two that really stick out to me in terms of sort of a title challenge and stuff like that. I think Liverpool are going to have to certainly do something, at least put in a performance in that first one and hopefully get themselves a victory. But I think the second one, just the timing of it in terms of that run, and I think that, fingers crossed, will feel absolutely massive, because that'll mean that Liverpool are in with a chance.
Yeah, Christmas, James, as we've discussed, from the 11th of December, Aston Villa at home, Newcastle United away, Newcastle United at home, Tottenham away, Leeds United at home, Leicester away, and then Chelsea away. Those fixtures are ones where, you could honestly say now that they would have could have a defining impact on Liverpool's season. That period of time in the calendar and fixture calendar is one in which Jurgen Klopp, as we know, has a good eye on every season, in terms of he wants to condition his teams to be motoring around that time. Obviously, last season there were other factors which meant that couldn't happen as well. But he's going to have a look at those fixtures, isn't he, when he gets the fixture list this morning, and he's going to earmark those to say, they're big, and if there's ever, a year to be qualified early in the group stages of the Champions League, for example, this is it because of those.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you mentioned last season, even then, like, Liverpool they limped through to top and at New Year. I mean,
yeah,
they didn't lose in that period. They had a couple of dodgy draws, which I think there was West Brom in there, Fulham, and maybe Newcastle, but they still went unbeaten, which, given the struggles at the time, it is quite a feat. And yeah, if you go back further, like you say, Klopp definitely has that kind of handle on the busy period, even though he's often one to complain about it in terms of just the congestion, the effect on the players. It does seem to be a time where he excels. So yeah, it's a good time to have the tough fixtures, but But Leeds in there is a killer. Like, it's such an intense game every time. To have that on Boxing Day and then have to go to Leicester 2 days later, surely something's got to give around them. But yeah, it's a testing time, but hopefully reason to be optimistic when you look at past form there.
I mean, on the flip side, it is hilarious that Liverpool are at home again on Boxing Day for what seems like the 100th consecutive year. So yeah, our blue neighbours surely won't be happy about that fact once again taking presence. So we're not here to actually talk about the fixtures throughout the show. We want to talk about and focus the show in and around the squad and look internally at Liverpool's squad. And what I've decided to do this week is to break the squad down into 4 groups, and we're going to discuss each group individually. It's a time of year, Matt, that everybody sort of looks out and looks externally in at what Liverpool and their own teams can do to get people in and to bolster the squads. But when you actually look into Liverpool's squad and you break it down into these 4 groups, it shows you that Klopp and his team have got a few decisions to make this summer beyond the basic ones. And I'll start with the youth group, I've called them, which is the Williamses, Nico and Reece, Curtis Jones, Kim Kelleher and Harvey Elliott. Now, I think the first thing with these is, I think, asking the question of, realistically, and they'll probably be asking it themselves, how much game time are they going to be afforded? What is their role within the squad? And, how much of a part, realistically, can each of those players play next season? And I get that there'll be different players and different merits and different contexts attached. But just as a group, how do you rate the prospects?
I think there's kind of a split in that group, I think, for me. I think Curtis Jones is obviously going to stick about. I think Harvey Elliott is probably in the same boat, just because I think the idea was for him to stick around last season. It was only when the opportunity came up for him to go to Blackburn that was kind of an obvious thing for him to do. It sort of fitted perfectly. Unless something like that came up, but at Premier League level this season, I'd be surprised if they let him go. And I think the same really for Nico Williams. I think if they were to let him go, you'd then have to bring in somebody else. I think it's more beneficial for Liverpool just to sort of keep hold of him. I think the interesting one in terms of who's likely to go out is probably Reece Williams. I think out of all of them, he's by far and away the most likely to go out and get a loan. And then it's kind of a decision of where you take him. Obviously, we know it's famous now that he's been out and been there for Kidderminster for a season, stepped up to the Champions League. I think it's realistic that somewhere in the Championship would probably be the right sort of level for him to go out and get regular game time next season. And then that just leaves the goalkeeper, Kelleher. We know that Adrian signed his new contract earlier this week, but Kelleher, by all accounts, is the number 2 goalkeeper still. That will still remain the case next season. So I think I'd be of a mind to keep him as well, not least because, Alisson Becker's injury record isn't particularly brilliant for a goalkeeper. He does miss a few more matches than you might think. I just think for him, there'll be opportunities to play. And I think it's kind of a decision almost for Kelleher's career. What does he want to be? Does he want to go and be a number 1 choice? And I think he can certainly do that in the Championship, probably the lower end of the Premier League as well. Or does he just want to be Liverpool's number 2, come in and play the cup games and things like that? So I think for him, it's more of a career decision. I think for Jones, Elliott and Nico Williams, that decision will kind of be taken for them. And for Reece Williams, I think it's a fairly obvious one that he should go out as well because, barring a similar freak situation to last season, I can't really see him getting too many minutes.
There's a really interesting Pep Lijnders quote a few weeks back, or might be even a few months back now, James, from him on Harvey Elliott, where he references how much he misses him around training. And he talks about how much he loved working with him on the training pitch and how much he was always, sort of constantly willing to learn and was like a sponge in terms of the information he'd given me to absorb and absorb and absorb. And I think there's something in that with these players, when we can blindly sometimes say, just get them alone and assume it's the best thing for them. You've got to think of the education they're getting, at Kirby, around players like Thiago, around players like, Roberto Firmino, consummate winners who are also, in terms of the day-to-day, the tactically supreme. They show you things on a training pitch. Again, Elliott's reference Firmino on the training pitch is just being absolutely next level and someone who he's in awe of. So that education at Liverpool shouldn't be discounted in any way for these boys, should it?
No, not at all. I mean, there are certain clubs where you look at them, you look at their profile, and you think, okay, that's the perfect loan destination. But they're few and far between, because obviously every team plays their own unique style. So the best Liverpool can really hope for is loans to the likes of Southampton. So you look at what they tried to do with Minamino. Ultimately, it wasn't a roaring success, even though he showed some promise. But most of the time, the loans that are going out, particularly for the younger players, they're just sort of generic championship teams. Obviously, some due diligence has gone in to see, which club would be the best fit for a player. But it's not as if they're sort of carbon copies of Liverpool. So, yeah, there's benefits to a loan. It's invaluable to get that kind of senior game time, of course, and it's going to stand people like Elliott in good stead. But whether it's that much more beneficial than, like you say, being in and around the squad, sort of having the Klopp and the Linders tactics drilled into them, especially with them literally flagging Elliott up as someone who's been very receptive to that kind of treatment. So, yeah, you look at it and you think there's no guarantee that the loan move is going to be any better for their development than keeping them around, even if, as we touched upon earlier, their game time is still going to be somewhat limited.
I think what's interesting as well, James, is when you look at them, and, again, you can take them in their own context, but you can argue that maybe Jones apart, really, because he's already established. But you can argue that all of them are only really one injury away from being starting games from Liverpool. And that's, when you look at it in that sense, the value is actually more increased then. Liverpool don't have a rich squad, and they don't have the healthiest squad in terms of injuries right now. And heading into next season, we've just discussed the fixtures. They're going to have to start quick. They're going to have to start on the front foot. I think if you're any of those boys, you'd be saying, well, one injury here and I'm in.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd say Reece Williams aside, given that he's probably about 4 injuries away at this point, with Konate coming in and Van Dijk, Matip, Gomez all coming back.
Maybe, yeah.
But yeah, aside from that, it's definitely, particularly the case of Nico Williams, because you look at him and he's definitely a big question mark player among the Liverpool fans, seems to divide the fan base quite a lot. But regardless of where you stand on how much potential he has, the fact is, if Trent gets injured, then he has to step up. Unless we're looking at moving Fabinho again or playing a 35-year-old Milner, neither of which are ideal. Surely you'd rather play that kind of, at least stylistically similar right back in there with Nico. So yeah, that they are going to be looking at it thinking, okay, I'm probably not going to be first choice, because we're looking at a team who've been Premier League and Champions League champions within the last 3 seasons. It's not easy to just waltz into the team, but equally, none of them, as I say, except maybe Reece Williams, are that far away, which has to be a source of encouragement.
I think as well, Matt, I think the thing to reference on this is just finally, you look at the broader picture of certainly the Premier League this summer. I think there'll be a lot of clubs who will have the attitude of, well, we've already got enough to sort. They won't want to create problems for themselves. Getting rid of Nico Williams, for example, means that you're probably going to have to buy a right back. But when you've already got 2 or 3, 4, 5 other priorities that you need to attend to in the season or in the summer, then that's a difficult one. You look at Crystal Palace, for example, they've got about 14 players out of contract. So sort of not creating more problems for yourself, I guess, is a plus point for these young lads, because they can stick around and be an option, and they can ensure that by virtue of again, Nico Williams just being at the club, Liverpool don't have, a huge problem potentially at right back should Trent Alexander-Arnold get injured.
Yeah, I think Nico is the obvious sort of example of that in terms of Trent, and they're not really being anybody else. But I think you could kind of say that for Kelleher as well. Would you be completely comfortable if Alisson was out for 2 or 3 months? Say, would you be comfortable with Adrian playing every single game? I'm pretty sure a lot of people, for them, the answer would probably be no for that. And I suppose you could say it for Harvey Elliott as well. I mean, we're talking about possibly, a Minamino, a Origi, Shaqiri possibly moving on. I'm sure we'll sort of touch on those guys later. But if you're sort of letting 2, possibly even 3 of those players go, you are going to have to bring at least 1, maybe 2 in. And if, Harvey Elliott can be one of those. Again, it's just one less thing on the to-do list for Liverpool. As we sort of touched on there, there's so many things that it's not just transfers either. It's contracts. It's all of that sort of thing. And I think if you can just make life a little bit easier for yourself, you probably would do that. And it's not as if by making that life easier, you're making life harder for these youngsters. I'm sure, if you'd have said to Harvey Elliott, do you want to go out on loan last season? He'd probably say yes. But equally, if you could have guaranteed him a few games at Liverpool, I'm sure he would have been happy with that as well.
Yeah, we'll move on to the next group, who I've coined the not going anywhere group. So within that, there's the front four, there's both fullbacks, there's injured and new centre-backs, so Virgil van Dijk, Joe Gomez, Joel Matip, Ibrahim Konate, all goalkeepers. As we know now, Adrian signed the deal. And I put Jordan Henderson, James Milner, Thiago and Fabinho in there. Are they all fair? First and foremost, James, I think is the question. I think we're right in saying that there's no question marks about any of those, and not just from a Liverpool importance point of view, but we wrote a piece yesterday on Raheem Sterling, and just looking at his situation, and the broad reality is for anybody who might be looking elsewhere this summer is, if you're at Liverpool, Chelsea, Manchester United or Manchester City, there isn't a lot of places you can go.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's been exacerbated by the pandemic as well, in the sense that even some of the bigger clubs abroad have felt the impact of it harder than the top English clubs. So some of the obvious destinations straight off the bat, they're just not possible anymore. And you look at Barcelona just trying to hoover up all the free agents in Europe at the moment. You look at Real Madrid, they're not in the position that they have been in the past to sort of assemble another Galacticos squad. So really, it's just as long as you can fend off any interest from maybe PSG and Bayern, then no one's going anywhere, really. There's not going to be a situation where Liverpool would sell any of those not going anywhere players to a domestic rival, you would have thought. So, yeah, as we pointed out in the Sterling piece, there's just very limited places for these top players to go. So yeah, I think it is a fair group that you've put together. Maybe in a non-pandemic year, it might have been a case that you look to move one of the big names on and refresh the squad with a Sancho or someone, but those plans have had to be shelved if ever they existed. So yeah, it's that same core group will be going into the new season without much of a doubt.
I guess interesting the concept of, in an alternative reality, a normal reality that we were used to before, whether or not Liverpool would have moved them on. I mean, the question now is where that leaves them and Liverpool. A lot of these players fall into the 2023, contract apocalypse group that we've referenced before on this podcast. And there's already talk about Addison and Fabinho getting deals this summer. But Mohamed Salah turned 29 yesterday. Virgil van Dijk, the same age. Jordan Henderson will be 31 this month, I think. So, what are your ideas? There's question marks here around what Liverpool do with them that will or can be left for a season. But you would imagine this conversation come next summer will be a lot more sort of urgent, and there'll be a lot more required answers around them.
Yeah, I think so. I think in terms of those who are sort of 2023, I think we're starting to see those, taking priority. I know Paul Gorst at the Echo has reported that, there's a long line of contracts that Liverpool will look at this summer. But even, some of those on that list are for kind of the year after as well. Andy Robertson, Trent Alexander-Arnold, they're both on the list for 2024 contract expirations, but they're going to sort of be on that list of being, given improved terms now to kind of get ahead a little bit of that problem. I think in terms of the ones who are kind of more got question marks over them, it's kind of more a Firmino, Mane, Henderson sort of situation, as you say. They're not on that priority list as far as we're aware for talks this summer. You'd imagine talks would come at some point for those players because, they are going to be very costly to replace. They're all, hugely influential parts of the squad when they're fit and fully ready. But there is that question at the back of your mind. I think Jordan Henderson is probably one that isn't a priority because it's fairly obvious that he'd want to stick around. There's not going to be a huge amount of negotiation that would need doing there, I wouldn't have thought. I think you can kind of see him taking on the James Milner role at some point. And I'm sure, there's kind of a thing within his contract, starting to look ahead to what does he want to do in the future. If he wants to become a coach, for example, in a few years' time, possibly that's something that you could think about when you start to renew these things. But Mane and Firmino, I think at some point the conversation will be had, but it's a question for Liverpool of that value. I mean, we kind of touched on it in terms of the to-do list and not giving yourself an extra job. It kind of ties in a little bit with that and a little bit in terms of the value. I mean, if you were to let Sadio Mane go and didn't offer him a new contract, well, are you actually saving any money? I'm not convinced that you necessarily would be, because obviously to replace Sadio Mane is going to cost a huge amount to sort of do that. So lots of questions to be answered. I think some of them sort of take care of themselves. Salah, Van Dijk, pretty obvious that you want to stick a new deal for them down. But yeah, for the others, there's kind of a little bit of a question mark, I think. Yeah,
I mean, if we look at it, then they're not going anywhere this summer, James. We then need to look at their importance, and I think it's not unrealistic to say that players like Sadio Mane could come back and have a peak Liverpool season at the age he's at. 29 is peak age. Let's not forget that. So Liverpool should be enjoying the fruits of these players at their best age. If they're going to keep them, if they're going to worry about things like futures and contracts and stuff later on with a lot of them, then the priority for everyone should be let's sort of maximise this moment and get the best out of the best years of our career here.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the mindset Klopp will be taking as well. He's not one to sort of concern himself with looking ahead like, oh, they're all out of contracts in 2023, so let's look at phasing them out. I mean, you look at how he handled the Gini Wijnaldum situation. He was playing as a regular right the way through to the end. Klopp is very much looking at the kind of footballing side of things, and that requires putting your best players out. As long as they're all still prepared to put in 100%, then they will be playing. And like you say, they're at that age where we could see their best form still, which is, I mean, it's a scary thought, particularly with the likes of Salah, who we've seen such ridiculous things from already. Just to imagine him kicking on even further is, well, it would help the league push no end. But yeah, we've written before about how burnout was a big part of last season, how it could affect the start of this season, and that is something to be mindful of. But hopefully, with a slightly more normal campaign now, slightly less COVID impacted, we will be looking at players back to a more standard workload. And hopefully with the likes of Sadio Mane, who's had that kind of inexplicable drop-off, it turns out that the explanation all along was just the accumulation of minutes. And when it returns to normality, we see the best of those players again. So yeah, there's definitely reason to be optimistic that we can see the kind of the Mane and Firmino of old in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. So the third group that we've got, Matt, is the get rid group. Obviously, that's a bit harsh on the lads, but we are where we are. That includes Harry Wilson, Marco Grujic, Xherdan Shaqiri, Divock Origi, Camille Grabara, Shea Ojo, Loris Karius, and Ben Woodburn. I think the first thing here is these lads have just got to get off the books, haven't they?
Yeah, I think there's got to be an acceptance, I think, from Liverpool that you're not maybe going to get the fees for all of these players that you once were. I think the time to get £20 million, for example, for Harry Wilson has probably passed. I think if you were going to get that, it probably would have been last summer. But then COVID comes in and all the rest of it. He's obviously spent a decent season at Cardiff in the Championship, but I think there's got to be a kind of acceptance that Liverpool can't just keep squeezing ridiculous money for Brewster, for Solanke and all of these types of players. You're not going to be able to necessarily sort of get that on these players. And I think the time has come for Harry Wilson. I think he's 24 now. It kind of goes under the radar, I think, a little bit of just how far into his career he is. I think last summer probably would have been the time to get a permanent move, but if not last summer, certainly this one. And you'd be surprised if there's any chance of him having a Liverpool future at that sort of age. So I think he's a talented player. I think there's definitely, a Premier League move in there for him. But, whether you're looking at anything, possibly not even to 15 million, I think Liverpool just have to come to an acceptance on that. And I think you can kind of say that for a few of those players. I think, the money that you get for Woodburn, Karius, definitely Ojo and Grabara is going to be very, very minimal. I think Loris Karius' contract is up next season, so it's kind of just get as much as you can before you lose them for nothing. And even with Grujic and Shaqiri, I think they kind of fall into the same sort of categories as Harry Wilson. Just get as much as you can for them because, even if their value has fallen to this point, it's not going to get back up again realistically, I don't think. So possibly Marco Grujic is maybe the most that you could get out of those players. He's had an okay season at Porto, but again, there's kind of rumours at the moment that maybe Hertha Berlin might come in for sort of 12 million euros or so. I think Liverpool would want a little bit more than that for him, but we just don't quite know at this moment in time what the benchmark is. I think once we start to see one or two transfer deals take place, you can then kind of start to assess what's fair and what's not fair for these players.
The interesting one on that list for me, James, is Shaqiri. I don't know who buys him, and I don't know who sees the value in him. Even for a 10 million punt, and he's undeniably gifted. He's undeniably talented. He's undeniably beneficial in many aspects. But when we talk about value and when we talk about, I think, some of the bargains that you can probably get this summer as a result of everyone just needing to sort the house out a little bit, I think Shaqiri's one who seems to fall down the list. I mean, even when you look at Origi, I think you can make a really good argument that West Ham United should buy Origi, for instance. And then you can break that down as to why. But, I think that Shaqiri's one, and Liverpool don't have many of them, who just represents that situation where you might come a little unstuck. And by the way, let's not forget, Liverpool bought him because he was on a £13 million buyout from Stoke. And it was a deal which suited everyone at the time. And Liverpool, I guess, were fully aware that they might end up in this situation with him. But he's one for me who I just look at and think, I'm not sure where you go, and I'm not sure who is sort of committed enough to taking you.
Yeah, it's really difficult because I think of that list that you've put together, he's probably technically the best player on it. So to say that he's the one we'd have the most trouble shifting seems strange. But yeah, you are right. You look at things like the age factor, for example, he's approaching 30. So it's not someone who is an obvious contender for, let's get him in and build around him, which is kind of what's needed if you're going to sort of get the best out of him. So, yeah, it may be one where Liverpool sort of put the name out there, but equally it is a situation where if you are kind of stuck with him, to put it harshly, it's not the worst situation to be in. It does take up some space on the wage bill, but, the odd game here and there, there's nothing to say that he can't make a difference. Klopp was sort of experimenting with him almost at centre mid at times last season when he did get minutes, which suggests that he's kind of looking to the future. Seems like an odd thing to do if you're thinking, I'll definitely be getting rid of him this summer, to try and give him a new position within that time. The trouble is, he's such a unique player. He's not a stylistic fit with Liverpool naturally. And like you say, of the sort of potential destinations, there aren't that many either where you think they're crying out for a Shaqiri. If I had to pick someone, maybe like a Watford, just one of those kind of newly promoted or lower down Premier League clubs who need that kind of talisman talent in there who can almost drag them to safety. But yeah, it's not an easy one to accommodate because he does need to play a very specific role, almost like he does for Switzerland on the international stage. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with him.
I've got an issue around two things, Matt. And the first is, Liverpool want bodies around pre-season. They want players just to be present so that they can take part in training, keep training levels up, to have enough people that they need to fulfill the pre-season needs. That's going to be the case again this summer because players will come back staggered from the Euros and the Copa America. And the other thing is, I would say Liverpool wouldn't be massively dependent on transfer funds coming in from those players. So I guess we might have to be a little bit patient with these guys and just see where the land lies with most of them still come sort of the end of August and see what happens then.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? It's that knock-on effect of what do Liverpool do in the transfer market, I think is massively impacted by who they can get out and how much they can get for them. I think it's partly in terms of funding these moves, certainly looking at, a potential extra attacker similar to what they did with Jota last summer. I think that probably will happen, but I don't think it happens until they can be fairly sure that Shaqiri, Wilson, possibly one or two others, Origi probably has moved on first. I think, one thing is dependent on the other, and that does mean that they will have to wait a little bit as well. So yeah, I think it's kind of in two ways. I think it's in terms of the number of bodies, but in terms of the valuations, can they get that money in? Can they get what they want for these players? And will that impact then what they can afford to bring in terms of additional players? I mean, I think we've all made clear that we'd quite like to see a replacement for Gini Wijnaldum come in, but the line from the club at the moment seems to be that they're not necessarily prioritising a midfielder. I think to me that kind of is more a case of they're prioritising getting rid of a few players first, and then they might come back and look at it at some point further down the line. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because it's not easy to get rid of all of those players. I think there's a long list of players. There's still a sort of uncertain group that we're going to come on to very shortly as well. I mean, the number of players who could leave does sort of add up pretty quickly, and it's partly in terms of just getting those deals and getting the money and doing the negotiations, but it's also in terms of balancing, as you say, the number of bodies in that squad in particular areas. I think it's a bit of a balancing act. I know for sure that Jurgen Klopp would just like to do all of the transfer business first, get all of the players in, and then sort of sort the rest of it out afterwards. But I just don't think that can be the case this summer. I think it is, obviously, with Konate already being in, but I think that's kind of a special situation. We all know what happened last season, but yeah, any more additions, I would imagine, are probably pretty much predicated on what happens in terms of outgoings.
And that last group is the uncertain group. James, Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, Naby Keita, Ben Davies, Nat Phillips, Kostas Tsimikas, and Takumi Minamino. Now you can argue that maybe Phillips and Tsimikas don't necessarily deserve to be in there, but there is a degree of a question mark, I think it's fair to say, around them in terms of this summer and beyond. I mean, the thing that jumps out to me here with all of them is the things that we don't know. And there are a lot of things that go on at Liverpool that we don't know. I would be tempted to say the majority of things we are, in a general sense, not just us here at Blood Red or Liverpool.com guessing at. But you would imagine there needs to be a degree of trust here on both sides when it comes to these players. If you're Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain, say, you need to trust that you're going to get more opportunities than you did last season. If you're Jurgen Klopp, you need to trust that, if you keep holding Takumi Minamino, he's going to give you something more than what, obviously, you wanted from him last season. So the trust element is massive, and I think it's especially prevalent around the likes of Chamberlain and Keita.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that trust is sort of helped by the fact that Klopp can point to some hard facts to back it up. It's not like a blind trust he's asking for. You can look at lots of players who have been eased in slowly at Liverpool and then gone on to have good careers in the Klopp era. I mean, I think it was Fabinho who barely played for the first few months, and now he's integral, of course. And then equally, in terms of the business that's already been conducted this summer, you can get Keita in, you can get Oxlade-Chamberlain into the office and say, look, Gini Wijnaldum's gone. He played a part in 38 league games last season. So I'm going to need to rely on you guys more. And that's something which it makes logical sense. And yeah, it does rely on a degree of trust, but like I say, not blind trust in that regard. So yeah, I think from the player's perspective, they'll be looking at it thinking there is still time here for me to salvage the Liverpool career.
Yeah, I think just on that, I think the other thing as well is the manager can say and put across is that he had to build a wall around centre-back last season. And that clearly meant that he had certain players who he felt were suitable to protecting the centre-backs as far as sort of midfield positions went. And that whenever he did sort of experiment with that, like Southampton away, Real Madrid away, you could see how quickly it unravelled and how quickly and keen he was to sort of not repeat it. But Matt, in terms of these guys, again, they all have a variance of context that is applicable to them, that is separate to each other. I mean, do you think that the manager will be quite relaxed about all of them in their own sort of space and just be saying, well, I'm happy to use them, I'm happy to keep them around, but if maybe an offer was to come in for Nat Phillips, for example, we take it on its merits, or Minamino in that case.
Yeah, I think so. I think for all of those players on that list, that's the case, apart from probably Tsimikas.
I think so too, yeah.
I think in terms of what we were saying about the to-do list, if you let him go, you've then got to do an extra one to get another left back in. So I think for him, that's pretty obvious that I think he will probably stay unless a ridiculous offer came in that you couldn't turn down. I think I'd probably have him as the safest one out of all of them. But I think for Chamberlain, Keita, Davis, Phillips and Minamino, it's just a case of looking at each offer as it comes in, as you say, on its own merits. I think there is a point at which you would probably let Naby Keita leave. I'd be reluctant to do it for less than sort of 25, 30 million. But if somebody was to come to the table with that sort of money, could you really afford to say no? I'm not 100% sure that you could, with, a couple of years left on his contract, the injury record, each year he's played less and less for Liverpool. Is there sort of enough of a pattern there to think that trend might continue? Quite possibly there is. I think the same really for Oxlade-Chamberlain. I think Jurgen Klopp would be more than happy to keep him about. He's obviously a very popular character within the dressing room. He's offers plenty when he is fit and firing. But there's a bit of me that thinks, again, if there was an offer, possibly at 25 million or something, to be put on the table from someone, say a West Ham, a Southampton, someone like that, if one of these teams did come in and put that money down again, I think it might just be a little bit too much to sort of say no to. But unless a big offer comes in for any of those players, I think they're kind of ones that you'd be happy enough if they stuck about. I mean, even if you got to, say, January and maybe the impact of COVID, maybe fans are back, maybe a few other clubs have got a little bit more money to spend, there's a bit more certainty about the future, maybe clubs would be more sort of willing to take a gamble in terms of signing a player in January rather than the summer. I think there's going to be opportunities for all of these players to move on at some point if they want to. But it's just a case for me, apart from Tsimikas, of sort of looking at it case by case and thinking, can we afford to say no? If we can't afford to say no, let them go. But if you can, I think you just save yourself a job and just keep them about.
Do you think there's any possibility of a loan in play for any of them, James? I look at Minamino as the obvious one in terms of someone else coming in with a loan and fee attached and taking him off Liverpool's hands for the season. Do you think Liverpool entertain that, or they'll want a sort of definitive answer on what they're doing with the players in sort of one way or another?
Well, particularly in the Minamino case, I'd be surprised if another loan was sanctioned. If it was, it would purely to put him in the shop window. So you saying, let's hope he has a good loan spell, and then if he does, we can maybe get a bit more from him next summer. But it's not going to be a loan for development at this stage in his career. I think he's 26. It will be a strange time to loan him out unless it's for that kind of, let's hope he can really up his value kind of way. But yeah, in that sense, I'm sure the club would much prefer just a definite answer either way, whether that's let's try and integrate him into the squad and make him a bigger part, or let's just cash in. I was going to say cut the losses, but it probably wouldn't even be a loss because it was such a good deal in the first place on the release clause. So yeah, in that particular case, I'd be surprised at a loan. But there's a couple of others in the list where you think, well, maybe. Ben Davies is obviously such a hard one to discuss because no one's ever seen him play for Liverpool. That it seems possible that would be a loan move, just because to buy him in January and then sell him in the summer without playing a game, it seems almost incomprehensible. So, but equally, he's not exactly going to be playing regularly, so a loan move could make sense there. Even then, it will probably be a case of a loan with a view to selling him next summer. But yeah, I don't think loans would be the preference in any of these cases, but maybe one or two. If a good offer came in, like you say, with a good fee attached, then we could see it.
Okay, that's been the Liverpool.com podcast this week. We hope you've enjoyed it. Do check out Liverpool.com and continue to check out Blood Red for all the content there. Huge thanks to Matt, huge thanks to James. We'll be back next week. Take care.